All right, so I'm going to take us on a little bit of a journey. There will be some down moments in terms of being a little depressing, but we'll hopefully end on a happier note, or at least a more hopeful note by the time we get to the end. I have been very interested in this question of labor flexibility and smart cities, and the connection between labor flexibility and the conversation about smart cities, and really how smart cities have produced cities or task cities as enabling platforms. And I'm really interested in what that means for precarious work. As you can see, the image here is a cover of MIT Technology Review from about a year ago. About once a year, the MIT Technology Review does a smart cities issue. It really very rarely does the conversation turn to the question of how we're actually looking at work and labor. I kind of look at it differently. I think that it's pretty important to understand cities as an organizing platform for work. This is not a new concept. We know this from the company town to industrialized cities, but really it shouldn't be a surprise at all that if we change the sort of infrastructure of the city, if we change the organization of the city, if we change what the technology investments are in the city, that it could indeed change the organization of work. What we see is that cities are beginning to become sort of producing their own, becoming workspaces that translate into increased flexibility and emerging, new and emerging employment sort of practice that becomes a new physical norm. I don't know if you all recognize this image, but this is the little island in Manhattan, which is built out onto old piers. So it's one of my favorite versions of, you can see the industrial past, right, as we're looking at what we call the sort of the new parkification of these spaces. Most of these are my images, and so I was saying to Todd earlier that I'm in an architecture school now. I'm an urban planner in an architecture school. So now I have to upgrade the images in my slides substantially. But I like to actually have images that I've taken, so that the intellectual property rules there, especially when we're on Zoom and such. Some of you will recognize these. This is the vessel on the top, again, sort of an iconic festival marketplace sort of production in Manhattan in the Hudson Yards development, which is sort of well known for the subsidization of that project. So one of the things to keep in mind is that regional variation is actually produced and managed in a number of ways. Cities are increasingly being treated as innovation sandboxes for new and different employment models and practices. So if you think about how Uber and ride sharing has developed, if you think about how Airbnb is developed, if you think about the sort of networks, if even the new parking meters that you can do with your apps on your phones, they're essentially you're talking about innovation sandboxes for different kinds of technologies, and behind those things often are either explicitly a new employment model or implicitly a set of new employment models and practices. So firms are piloting these new forms of work and using the city as the functional platform for it. It's important to note that this is density driven in many ways, so that it's very difficult to do these pilots and this kind of on a platform that's not particularly dense, because the ICT infrastructure just basically isn't sufficient to do that. It's in terms of a sort of a market driven process. So for the tech industry, it's important to keep in mind that cities are kind of an organizing geography for these production processes and for the development of these new work models. So what does work actually look like in a 21st century city? Some of you guys might recognize some of this. This is part of the development in Manhattan as well, including the triangle building there. The big triangle is the Bjarke Ingels Group building, so the big building. So the smart cities produce flexible workspaces that incubate and facilitate and reflect labor flexibility. And a little of the backstory on this is about urban entrepreneurial spaces, which is a discussion in economic geography and urban geography that predates this, of course. And you have to think about the stories about small business incubators, startup accelerators, corporate and university innovation districts. All of that is tied to this question of how do you make the platform for work the city rather than the firm itself. So as the enabling platforms extend labor and flexibility and casualization, they do this in a number of ways. One way they do this is by not actually tailoring the city to any particular sort of industrial specialization. So in the past, we had cities that were particularly, Motor City, Detroit and autos, or Silicon Valley. In the smart cities discourse, places are just tech city, and they're kind of undifferentiated in the fact that their infrastructure is sufficient to actually produce tech. And then whatever the industrial specialization is layered on top of this capacity to be branded as having the technology that is sufficient to be a smart city. And so what many cities are driven to do is actually provide sort of a permissiveness to technological experimentation in order to sort of not get left behind in this story. So there isn't really a clear argument that this is the industrial specialization that you'll end up with, but there is a clear argument that if you don't invest in the smart city, you will have no industrial specialization in the new knowledge economy, right? So what ends up happening is we get this technological experimentation that's allowed and a policy environment that really allows this kind of framing around a more casual, more precarious, and more experimentation in general. Things that we don't really usually associate with the public sector experimentation. But in this case, we are increasingly seeing that. Certainly in the US context in particular, the e-scooters is one of the examples of this, that many cities have just kind of let firms come in with the e-scooters and just do whatever they want. And then they work out later that maybe there might be something you want to do about regulating how these are used or where they go or how, and whether they are treated as pedestrians or whether they're treated as cars or whether they're treated as bicycles, and what spaces they're provided. So a lot of the backstory of this ties into the idea that there's a managerialism versus entrepreneurialism for cities and city governments themselves. And the idea that in some ways, we tend to think about cities and what their role is. We think about them as being managing services, managing civic services. One of the things that David Harvey kind of reminded us of is that in fact, there is in this economic development story and this growth machine story, this role for cities to actually be entrepreneurial, for them to be trying to be actors and investors and leading investment. And that's a little bit different from the role of being a manager of civic services. So if in fact smart cities fits very much into this model of urban entrepreneurialism rather than in managerialism. Now, this is in fact the case, but the rhetoric tends to sometimes go a different way, where you hear the advocacy to citizens around smart cities technologies really is about optimizing services very often, rather than this question about how it invests in, how it is a foundation for economic activity or economic investment. And certainly there's very little conversation about what this has to do with work. So just as a reminder, the two outcomes of urban entrepreneurialism and sort of previous iterations of this, one is interjurisdictional competition, so competition between places, and then the other is financialization around real estate development. And we see both of those things going on with the Urban Technology Project or the Smart Cities Project as well. So in the Smart Cities Project, we have to remember what it is, what the city is in the Smart Cities Project. We know what the SMART is, which tends to actually be sort of investments in information and communication technologies and incumbent systems and incumbent infrastructure. The city in the Smart Cities Project is really a preferred scale. So the metaphor there being the sandbox. It's also the idea that the administratively and regulatory distinct site, the city is administratively and regulatory distinct from other places. So the metaphor there tends to be oil and extraction of resources, particularly data, not to mention, and also to understand behaviors. And then there's a public partner in subsidy and risk reduction for firms. So the industrial state is sort of the model there. But cities as a partner for firms who are trying to do the development of these new technologies and new work processes, the city becomes their partner in subsidy and risk reduction. So particularly on the question of facilitating a flexible work, what we see is that what is going on currently is not actually enabling resilience and adaptation very well. Certainly not in the interests of work. So labor flexibility and contingency is increasing, but we see very little work on career ladders, very little work on skill, and very little work on understanding that the city has responsibilities or implications within that. So we see that the shifting responsibilities and risks and costs are along healthcare, social security, and labor market reproduction are being shifted to the individual. In the smart cities context, you have to think about this in terms of what you see being shifted to sort of the city. And the COVID context is a really good example, and I'll talk about this in a minute a little bit, that when we think about things like public health, a lot of that got shifted to the city, right? So a lot of that got shifted to the locality. When we look at the questions of just simple provisioning of sort of workspace, if you think about all the workspace issues that have come up, and we'll talk about those in a second, much of that is getting shifted to the city. So what we saw originally in sort of labor flexibility was shifting to the individual, a lot of these costs. Now we're also seeing a lot of those costs and risks being shifted to the city as well through this question of technology. So there's a technology investment in the city as the work platform. So really the blurring of lines around the contractor model is one example of this. The idea that many of the emerging models of precarious work blur the lines between employee, user, and consumer. If anybody has taken Uber lately, the Uber driver is both a user of the technology platform, an employee of Uber, and also a consumer of the IT enabling devices that are there so that they can actually do their work, including the service embedded good, which is the iPhone that they almost all use to do the navigation and all the navigation platforms involved. So this idea of where precarious work not just being about the labor market relationship or the employment relationship, but also being about these relationships as a user and consumer as well. And workers provide and pay for these services that enable them to actually perform the work. I could say a lot about that, but I'll just keep moving. So work in smart cities can be performed outside the traditional employment relationship and the traditional workspace. And this is the distinction that is really sort of going forward now, is that the idea of creating the city or the dense urban environment as the workspace fully formed, regardless of where your firm is. So once you had employers who offered health insurance, pensions, and skill training, that's when we started talking about labor flexibility as those eroded. Now we have employers who once offered you a desk and a computer and some office space and your IT connection. They offered you your heat, light, plumbing, right? And again, thinking about the ride-sharing drivers. Now what we have is a work from home situation, which has become sort of the stress test of this precarious workspace arrangement model, which had already been underway in some ways. But the COVID environment was really a stress test to figure out which occupations and across which sectors and which job functions could be deterritorialized. So it isn't really about homework, it's about not being at work. Is the distinction there. So thinking a little bit more about what COVID-19 exposed in this area is that, you know, we can, when we think about the public provisioning of a workspace, of a sort of civic infrastructure, we need to keep in mind that all infrastructure can fail. And in some cases in the COVID-19 situation, what we found, at least in the US context, is we found that many systems failed all at once. So the public health system may in very many ways be the one that most people talk about. But concurrently with that, we saw the water system fail in a number of large cities. We saw the electricity grid in Texas go down for days because of an ice storm. And it's something that probably makes no sense in this context here, that an ice storm can take an entire state's energy grid down. But keeping in mind that the actual project of upgrading a platform for work to the level to this level is a task that we have not embraced sufficiently if this is what we're actually going to do. So really the distinction here is between third space and your own space, right? So we previously had been talking about putting workers into co-working spaces, maker spaces, incubators, all of that was already going on. But now, and within that, there were all sorts of conversations about the role of labor market intermediaries and institutions in sort of facilitating and managing and maybe having an opportunity to build some capacity within this third space way. But with the COVID accommodations and restrictions, those things really fell away because they were close contact spaces, right? The co-working spaces. And instead, what we ended up with was your space, and that intermediate third space conversation sort of fell to the wayside. And it's important to keep in mind that those intermediate spaces had actually, I'm going to go forward, had revenue models for flexible workspaces. So the revenue models for those co-working spaces were things like space as a service. So that's just essentially renting the space as a community, so that there were being able to build community and also create revenue models around community provision and community, space as a network or networking, but also space as labor flexibility. So we end up with this question of, cities are a platform for what? Well, do we want them to be platforms for, we know they're platforms for work, but what kind of work do we want them to be a platform for? And what does it mean when we tie together this question of urban entrepreneurialism with a very explicit movement towards precarious work and flexible work? Is that in fact the goal of what we're trying to do here? And this is just an example. On the top is Ponce City Market that's in Atlanta, and the bottom is Chelsea Market, which is in New York City. And they look really similar because they are two industrial redevelopment projects done by the same German firm. And so you can see that what we're talking about is provisioning this flexible workspace. This is, and Google has offices in both of them, that you can see that this is in fact something that is becoming sort of a model. One thing I always say, and this because I work in a city planning program at the moment, is that this process of doing urban innovation is in fact work itself. And we need to keep in mind that in order to actually confront and understand what's going on in terms of precarious work platforms in the smart cities context, we are actually going to have to provision some work on that project as well. And then finally, I said there'd be something positive to say at the end, is that there are some alternative futures here. One is that if we are returning to managerialism, we need to think about whether or not, instead of entrepreneurialism as sort of the role for the city in this project, then we really need to think about sort of the level of services and having a baseline and an even and a fair and equitable distribution of these services, which is not in fact the case right now. And then if we're going to do the entrepreneurialism path, if we're going to have urban entrepreneurialism, then maybe there is a participatory process here where we can start thinking from the bottom up about what kind of work we want to see in our cities and use some of the regulatory authority, which lies within most cities, to define some of that. If the city is the territory where we're going to do precarious work, let's regulate it at the city scale. Thank you.